Discussion 3.4a through B. So this is where we talk about species. At the outset, this question, what is a species, seems to be a very simple problem in that we should be able to come up with a simple definition. As it turns out, it's actually much harder than one might expect. This is a recent article in The Guardian. It's fun to read. You don't need to, but basically it reviews current understanding of species concepts, the idea of how we define a species. And in his overview, he says there are 27 distinct competitors that he found, which he can class into 7 major concepts or ideas. And there are some ways to simplify it, but it turns out that there's no single simple answer to this question, what is a species? So even though most biologists, the vast majority, agree that a species is a real thing, it's a real unit, it's very useful, we've used it for several hundred years, going all the way back to Linnaeus, and even technically before that, even before it was called a species, we've used this idea. But it's not an easy, simple concept. So just know that there's no simple answer to what is a species. However, there are a couple of ideas and concepts that allow us to encompass nearly all species. There are a few exceptions to this rule, and there are special cases where we might need to apply a very specialized species concept. Now, I'm not going to make you learn all 27 subcategories or even all of the 7 major categories that are outlined here in this article, but there are 3 that are the most important, at least I would argue, and the most widely used. So you need to know those 3. The first one, which is by far the most commonly used historically and even today, is the morphological species concept. Basically, this is a group of organisms that all look very, very similar to one another. Now, this does not work for all species, but it works for a vast majority. And this is an easy one because we learn this from a very, very young age. So, species 1, even though there's variety and diversity represented by the spread in these individuals in the population, they are very different and distinct from species 3. So, if this represents all cats, you're not, with a quick examination, going to confuse a cat with a dog, for instance, right? Or even a lion with a tiger, right? So morphologically, they are different enough that despite variety and diversity, we can recognize them. Now, what traits we should use to define and draw the boundaries between these different species can be tricky. In some groups, color might be a great definition, but in other groups, color may be useless. So the traits are going to vary depending on the groups of species that we're looking at, okay? But basically, species look different from other species. That's the morphological species concept. And so there's some strengths to this. Number one, it's fairly universally applicable. You can do it for most species. It's easy and relatively inexpensive, just requires some effort, some observation to use. And it's usually fairly easy that you don't need any specialized equipment, right? You can just look at it and make observations, maybe take some notes. Now, the weaknesses are, for some organisms, they don't have a very pronounced morphology, like bacteria. Now, we can make very easiest, obvious differences between certain groups of bacteria, like we have the coccus bacteria that are small balls. We have the spirillus that are like springs or helices, right? But within that group, if we have 2 coccic bacteria, coccids, then we might not be able to distinguish them just by physically looking at them. And so organisms without pronounced morphology make this difficult. And then there are some species that, despite looking at least externally identical, are really good, well-defined species, but we need to use a different species concept. So that brings up species concept number 2. The biological species concept is one that relies on mating and barriers to gene flow. So if we have populations that are able to mate with one another and have offspring, even if they look different, then we call them a single species. And so because population 5 can't mate with species or population 7 or 4 or 6, we define those differently. Now, this is a very objective criterion. However, it's not always cut and dried, meaning that there might be grades. So for instance, lions and tigers are recognized as separate species. However, there is the ability to interbreed and potentially have a small amount of gene flow. So to have gene flow, we need not only have mating between individuals in the different populations, but then those offspring need to be able to mate and be successful also. So genes from one population, or alleles maybe is a better term at this level, alleles from one population can migrate and get over into another population. And so it's not always just an on or off switch. There are grades, and it can be difficult to decide at what point there is enough gene flow to call it one species versus not enough and call them separate species. And then also another major weakness of this is that it doesn't obviously apply to asexually reproducing species, right? Because there is no gene flow via these standard methods of reproduction that we're talking about. So it doesn't apply to asexual species, okay? But again, it's very, very useful. Now, for most species, whether you use the morphological species or the biological species concept, both will do a good job at defining species boundaries for a vast majority of species. But there are some exceptions to the rule. And so the final one that we're going to talk about is the phylogenetic species concept. This is doing species boundaries based on relationships. So we find the smallest possible defined monophyletic group, and that becomes a single species. Now again, this can be a powerful objective way to do it. Two people given the same data set would most likely arrive at the same answer, and there wouldn't be any arguments about it. But the weakness is it takes a lot of time and energy and effort. So usually we leave this one if the morphological species and the biological species are not working really well, or there's some sort of a conflict between individuals. Then we might gather a big data set, do an analysis, and figure out whether they're a single monophyletic group or whether they group together with other members from other populations. So it takes a lot of time and energy and effort to define using a phylogenetic species concept. Okay, those are the three species concepts you need to know. Review them. Realize there are others. So there's some that are based on ecology, or there's some that are based on a specialized, just only apply to a very small group of organisms. Then there are flavors of all those main kinds. But for our purposes, you need to know those three, and then you just need to recognize that there might be others that are necessary and applicable in other instances.